fact that they found 1,800 rolls of papyri from one villa in Herculaneum is absolutely staggering.
Researchers have done what experts declared impossible for centuries. Buried beneath volcanic debris from Mount Vesuvius, ancient manuscripts carbonized into coal have begun revealing their secrets again.
I talked to conservators who essentially said I would never be given the permission to do anything with that material because it was too fragile.
This time, not through traditional methods, but through machine learning. 3 college students took up the challenge, and with nothing but determination and algorithms, brought ancient mysteries back to life.
You can't sit at a table, put the papyrus flat on that table, look through the microscope, and you'll see everything.
What they discovered inside wasn't just literature or philosophical thought. It was knowledge potent enough to transform our understanding of history forever. Where the catastrophe started. On the 24th of August in the year 79, Mount Vesuvius in the Campania region of Italy detonated with a force that would have dwarfed 100,000 nuclear explosions. The blast sent a column of ash 15 miles into the sky, visible all the way from Rome. But what came next was even worse. A pyroclastic surge of gas and volcanic debris that raced down the mountain at 400 miles per hour, with temperatures exceeding 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Herculaneum was only 6 miles from the crater, a wealthy town overlooking the Bay of Naples where Rome's elite kept vacation villas. When that surge hit, people didn't have time to run or hide. They died mid-step, on the spot. Their bodies flash-heated where they stood. Stone buildings crumbled under the force. Marble statues shattered, and in one massive villa perched on the coastline, something strange happened to an entire library. The scrolls inside didn't burn to ash the way you'd expect. The heat was too intense and too brief for normal combustion. Instead, the papyrus underwent a process called carbonization, meaning that the organic fibers transformed into something resembling coal. The material blackened and hardened into solid cylinders that looked more like pieces of firewood than documents. The ink, also carbon-based, melted into the papyrus itself until both became chemically indistinguishable. Then Vesuvius buried everything under 60 feet of volcanic rock and hardened mud, sealing the villa in what would become a perfect time capsule. There the scrolls stayed, preserved in absolute darkness, for over 16 centuries. But here's an interesting thing about this story. The very disaster that should have destroyed these texts forever was actually the only reason they survived at all. And what they contained would turn out to be far more significant than anyone imagined, if only someone could figure out how to read them without turning them to dust. The discovery in the well. Now, in 1750, workers digging a well near the modern town of Herculaneum struck something unusual buried deep in the hardened volcanic rock. Bronze statues emerged first, then marble columns, then the outline of what would later be identified as the Villa of the Papyri, one of the most luxurious estates ever discovered from the ancient Roman world. The complex sprawled over 250 meters with multiple levels, elaborate courtyards, and manicured gardens that once overlooked the sea-lined every corridor were bronze sculptures of gods, athletes, and philosophers. Frescoes covered the walls in rich pigments that had somehow survived burial. But the real treasure was locked up in one particular room on the ground floor. Shelves upon shelves, hundreds of them, each one lined with what appeared to be charred logs, arranged in neat, deliberate rows. When scholars examined these logs more closely, the truth hit them like a shockwave. These weren't logs at all. They were scrolls, over 1,800 of them, carbonized but remarkably intact, and not just any scrolls. These were originals or near originals, written and shelved before Vesuvius erupted, meaning they hadn't been copied by medieval monks or edited by Renaissance scholars. They were pure primary sources, frozen at the exact moment history stopped. Now, to understand why this mattered so much, here's something you need to know about how ancient texts survived. Every Greek and Roman work we have today, Homer's epics, Plato's dialogues, the plays of Sophocles, exists only as copies made generations or even centuries after the original authors died. In the ancient world, books weren't printed. They were hand-copied by scribes, and each time someone copied a manuscript, errors crept in. Words were misread, lines were accidentally skipped, passages were corrected when they seemed confusing or contradicted the copyist's beliefs. Over centuries, these changes compounded until scholars couldn't be certain what the original authors had actually written. Medieval monasteries controlled which texts survived. Monks preserved what aligned with Christian doctrine and let pagan works disappear. By the Renaissance, entire libraries of ancient knowledge had completely vanished. We know these works existed because other authors quoted them or mentioned them in surviving texts, but the originals were gone, lost to fires, wars, censorship, and the simple decay of time. The Herculaneum scrolls bypassed all of that. They sat on those shelves the day Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, containing whatever their owners had written or collected, completely unaltered by the centuries that followed. No medieval monk had decided they were too pagan to preserve. No Renaissance scholar had chosen what deserved survival. Whatever was written inside remained exactly as the author intended. Pure, unedited ancient thought sealed in volcanic rock. Scholars realized immediately that they were standing in the only intact library from the ancient world ever discovered. The implications were staggering. But there was one catastrophic problem that would haunt researchers for the next 270 years. Opening the ancient scrolls. Nobody could open them without destroying them completely. The scrolls were far too fragile, carbonized to the point where even the gentlest touch caused them to crumble into powder. Scholars attempted everything they could imagine. They used razor-sharp blades to slice scrolls open lengthwise, hoping to glimpse text between the layers, but the papyrus disintegrated on contact. They applied various chemical treatments designed to soften the material, but the scrolls dissolved instead. Some tried peeling them by hand with magnifying glasses and infinite patience, working for months on a single scroll, but it didn't matter. The moment any pressure was applied, the carbonized papyrus shattered like glass. One particularly determined scholar in the 1750s, a priest and inventor named Antonio Piaggio, designed an elaborate mechanical device specifically for unwrapping the scrolls. His machine used weighted threads and adjustable tension to slowly peel the outer layers away from the core. The process was painstakingly slow. It took nearly 4 years to process a single scroll. Most were destroyed in the attempt. The few fragments that survived were so damaged, darkened, and incomplete that experts spent decades arguing about what the original text had even said. Letters were missing. Words were fragmented. Entire passages had vanished during the unwrapping process. By the early 1800s, the academic community accepted defeat. The scrolls were carefully placed in museum storage facilities in Oxford, Naples, and Paris, where they essentially became curiosities, objects everyone knew were important, but nobody could use. What made the situation even more frustrating was that excavations at Herculaneum had revealed something else. The villa that had been uncovered appeared to be only part of a much larger complex. Ground-penetrating surveys suggested more rooms existed underground, deeper than excavators could safely reach. If the discovered section contained 1,800 scrolls, how many more might be waiting below? Some researchers estimated thousands of additional scrolls could still be buried at the site, an entire second library that had never seen daylight since Vesuvius erupted. 270 years went by. The scrolls sat in darkness, their secrets locked away. While technology advanced in every other field, humans split the atom, landed on the moon, and built machines that could think. That is, until a computer scientist who wasn't even looking for ancient texts decided to try something different that was beyond anything you could have imagined. A window of breakthrough. Dr. Brent Seals wasn't really looking for fame when he started working on the damaged manuscripts in the early 2000s. As a computer science professor at the University of Kentucky, he'd only become fascinated by a specific problem: how to read texts that were too fragile to physically open. He'd spent years developing something called virtual unwrapping, a technique that used CT scans and artificial intelligence to digitally reconstruct the contents of damaged documents without ever touching them. The concept sounded pretty simple. Scan the object with high-resolution X-rays. Feed that data into machine learning algorithms trained to detect patterns invisible to human eyes. Then reconstruct the text digitally, layer by layer, without ever physically unrolling the document. He'd already proven the concept worked on other damaged texts. In 2016, his team successfully read the Engedi Scroll, a Hebrew manuscript from the 1st or 2nd century that had been burned in a synagogue fire and subsequently fused into a solid, unreadable block. Using virtual unwrapping, they recovered the text of Leviticus without ever touching the fragile material. The academic world took notice, but the Herculaneum scrolls presented an entirely different challenge, one that seemed nearly impossible to solve. Now, here stands one catastrophic problem. The Herculaneum scrolls were made of papyrus, thin sheets of plant fiber that had carbonized in the intense heat. The ink ancient scribes used to write on the papyrus was also carbon-based, typically made from soot or charcoal mixed with gum and water. When CT scans hit the scrolls, the paper and the writing showed up identically on the imaging. There was no contrast between them, no way to distinguish text from background. The scans just showed one solid black mass of carbonized material. However, Seals had noticed something subtle that everyone else had missed. When ancient scribes wrote on papyrus, the ink didn't just sit on the surface like paint on canvas. It seeped slightly into the material, creating microscopic changes in the physical structure of the papyrus fibers. Where ink had been applied, the surface texture was somewhat different. The fibers were compressed differently, arranged differently, structured differently, at a level invisible to their observation. Those differences were far too small for the human eye to detect even under magnification, but perhaps a machine could learn to see them. And so he set to work. He spent years training neural networks on exactly this problem. He fed his algorithms thousands of data points per square millimeter of papyrus, teaching them to recognize the faint textural shadows left behind by ancient writing. But the problem was that AI wasn't even detecting ink left on paper. By 2023, Seals had refined the technology enough to attempt the Herculaneum scrolls. He had high-resolution CT scan data from several scrolls. His AI models were trained and ready. But he needed something else, fresh perspectives and new approaches. People who could look at the problem from angles he hadn't considered. So he did something unusual for academic research. He launched a public competition with serious prize money attached, opening the challenge to anyone in the world who wanted to try. What happened next would prove that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the most unexpected places. The competition and the heroes. The Vesuvius Challenge went live in March of 2023, with backing from Seals and several tech world sponsors, including Nat Friedman, the former CEO of GitHub. They offered over $1 million in total prizes, with a grand prize of $700,000 for whoever could successfully read 4 passages from the scrolls, each passage containing at least 140 characters of legible, verifiable ancient Greek text. Seals made all the CT scan data publicly available for download. Anyone could access it. University students, professional researchers, even amateur coders working from their bedrooms. Your background, credentials, and academic pedigree didn't matter. If you could train an algorithm to read carbonized papyrus, the prize was yours. Hundreds of people registered within weeks. Teams formed at universities across multiple continents. For months, progress crawled forward in small increments as competitors experimented with different neural network architectures, training methods, and image processing techniques. Then in August of 2023, a 21-year-old computer science student from Nebraska named Luke Ferreter broke the first code. Ferreter had been training a convolutional neural network to scan the papyrus data for tiny variations in surface texture that might indicate where ink had been applied 2,000 years ago. His model, after processing millions of data points, suddenly flagged something in one of the scans. A word, clear and readable. Porphyros, which means purple. It was the first word anyone had successfully read from a sealed Herculaneum scroll in over 2,000 years. Ferreter won the first letters prize of $40,000 for that discovery, and his success proved the technology actually worked. You could really extract readable text from what looked like lumps of coal. But Ferreter wasn't the only one closing in on a solution. Youssef Nader, a PhD student and biorobotics researcher working in Berlin, was attacking the same problem using similar machine learning approaches. So was Julian Schilliger, a robotics student from Switzerland, who'd been refining his own neural network models for months. None of them were archaeologists or classicists. They were coders who understood pattern recognition, neural network architecture, and how to train AI systems to detect signals humans couldn't perceive. For months, all 3 college kids worked independently, each refining their models and trying to pull more text from the scans. Then they realized something that would prove decisive. They were all solving pieces of the same puzzle using complementary techniques. If they combined their approaches, sharing insights and methods, then they might be able to crack not just isolated words, but entire passages of continuous text. So they formed a team, bringing together their different neural network architectures and training methods into a unified system. Their combined method was sophisticated, yet elegant in execution. They used multiple neural networks working in parallel to analyze the CT scan data at resolutions measured in micrometers. By training their models on thousands of examples of what ink-affected papyrus looked like versus blank papyrus, they taught the algorithms to automatically recognize these patterns across entire scrolls. Once trained, the AI could scan through massive datasets and map out where writing had occurred with remarkable accuracy. By February of 2024, they'd accomplished what seemed impossible just months before. Over 2,000 characters revealed across multiple columns continuous passages of ancient Greek text. complete sentences that scholars could read, translate, and analyze. The competitions panel spent weeks verifying every detail. They confirmed it all. The text was authentic, correctly identified, and fully legible. The 3 students won the $700,000 grand prize. News exploded across academic circles and mainstream media. The New York Times ran a feature, the BBC covered it extensively. National Geographic called it one of the most significant archaeological breakthroughs of the decade. For the first time in human history, someone had read an ancient document that had been physically unreadable for 2 millennia, and 3 college students who'd never taken a single course in ancient history or classical studies had made it happen, using nothing but machine learning, persistence, and creative problem solving. But now came the question everyone wanted answered. What did the scrolls actually say? And was it even worth all this effort? The content and the villa. The deciphered text turned out to contain a philosophical discussion about the nature of pleasure, specifically exploring whether scarcity makes experiences more enjoyable. The ancient author debated whether having less of something, say rare foods like capers, expensive purple dye, infrequent musical performances, increased its value and the pleasure derived from it. The text also mentioned specific examples. Whether a musician heard once a year brings more joy than one heard daily. Whether foods that are hard to obtain taste better than abundant ones. Whether the rarity of purple-dyed cloth made it more beautiful to those who wore it. The writing almost certainly belonged to Philodemus of Gadara, an Epicurean philosopher who lived in the 1st century BC and wrote extensively on aesthetics, ethics, and the philosophical approach to daily life. The Epicureans, contrary to popular misconception, didn't advocate for hedonistic excess. They believed happiness came from simple pleasures, intellectual pursuits, friendship, and avoiding unnecessary pain. Philodemus had produced numerous treatises on music, poetry, rhetoric, and the art of living well, works that emphasized moderation, reflection, and finding contentment in life's ordinary moments rather than chasing wealth or fame. But here's what made this discovery truly significant. Only about 5% of one scroll had been fully deciphered. 1,795 scrolls remained completely untouched, their contents still locked in carbonized papyrus. Yet the technology worked. That single fact changed everything. The Villa of the Papyri itself provides crucial context for understanding what these scrolls might contain. This wasn't just another wealthy Roman house. Archaeological evidence suggests it belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, who was Julius Caesar's father-in-law and one of Rome's most prominent patrons of the arts and philosophy. Piso was known for supporting philosophers, poets, and intellectuals, using his considerable wealth to collect rare manuscripts and sponsor scholarly work. He maintained relationships with some of the most important thinkers of his time, including Philodemus himself, who may have lived at the villa as Piso's personal philosopher and librarian. If Piso owned the villa, these scrolls weren't random books you could find in any public library in Rome. They were a curated collection, carefully selected by someone with education, refined taste, and access to texts most Romans would never see. This raises the stakes considerably. Among those 1,800 scrolls might be rare manuscripts, possibly unique copies of works that existed nowhere else in the ancient world, lost plays by Greek tragedians, missing volumes of Roman histories, philosophical treatises that were referenced by other authors but vanished from every other library. And there's another detail scholars can't ignore. The villa that was excavated in the 1750s appears to be only part of a much larger complex. Modern ground-penetrating radar and other archaeological surveys have revealed what look like additional rooms underground, buried too deep or in too dangerous a location to excavate safely. If the discovered section contained 1,800 scrolls, how many more might be waiting in those unexplored chambers? Some researchers estimate there could be thousands of additional scrolls still buried at Herculaneum, an entire second library that's been sitting untouched beneath volcanic rock for 2 millennia. For 200 years, scholars knew what was down there, but couldn't access it. The technology didn't exist to read the scrolls they'd already found, so excavating more seemed pointless. But now that equation had completely changed, and the implications were starting to hit the academic world like a shockwave. The significance and implications. When the 3 students cracked that first scroll in February of 2024, the breakthrough wasn't really about the content itself, it was about what it proved was possible. Virtual unwrapping actually worked in the real world, not just in laboratory conditions. You could take a scroll that looked like a lump of charcoal, scan it without touching it, feed the data to AI systems, and extract readable text from the other end. That meant all 1,800 excavated scrolls were potentially readable, not just fragments or isolated words, but complete works with full philosophical arguments, poems, histories, or whatever else they contained. The implications hit academia immediately and have been reverberating ever since. Some optimistic scholars began making wish lists of texts they hoped to find, works that ancient sources mentioned, but that had vanished from every library, and collection poems by Sappho, the ancient Greek lyric poet whose work was so celebrated that she was called the 10th Muse, but whose poems mostly disappeared, leaving us with only fragments and quotations. The missing books of Livy's monumental 142-volume History of Rome, of which only 35 books survived through medieval copying lost comedies by Menander, considered one of the finest Greek comic playwrights. Though nearly all his work vanished, scientific treatises by Hellenistic scholars on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering that were quoted by later authors but lost in their entirety. Then in February of 2025 came another major announcement that showed how rapidly the technology was advancing. Researchers had generated the first complete image of the interior structure of Scrollferk 172, not just isolated words or phrases, but multiple full columns of text, showing approximately 26 lines each of continuous readable ancient Greek. All of that information had been completely invisible for 2,000 years. Now it was visible, and it didn't require destroying the scroll to see it. But perhaps the most exciting implication involves those unexplored rooms still buried beneath Herculaneum. This changes the entire calculus of whether it's worth attempting further excavation at Herculaneum. The site is notoriously difficult and dangerous to dig because modern buildings sit directly on top of the ancient city. The volcanic rock is incredibly hard and expensive to remove, and the risk of damaging priceless artifacts has always been high. Seals and his team continue refining the technology. The neural networks are becoming more sophisticated at detecting increasingly faint texture changes in the papyrus. The scanning resolution keeps improving as CT technology advances. The AI models learn from every scroll they process, getting better at recognizing patterns and distinguishing genuine text from background noise. Multiple teams worldwide are now competing in the 2024 and 2025 Vesuvius challenges, with new goals set to read 90% of 4 complete scrolls by the end of 2025. And now, the scrolls keep speaking, slowly but steadily, letter by letter, word by word, sentence by sentence. Thoughts that were sealed away when Vesuvius exploded are emerging back into human knowledge. What comes next could fundamentally redefine how we understand the ancient world, not through speculation or reconstructed fragments, but through original texts written by the people who actually lived in that civilization. We might uncover historical accounts that contradict, confirm, or completely reshape what we thought we knew about critical moments in ancient history, like the fall of the Roman Republic, the spread of Greek philosophy, the daily life of ordinary people, the religious beliefs that competed with early Christianity. Or we might find something completely unexpected, texts that nobody was looking for, ideas so different from what survived in copied manuscripts that they force us to rethink entire fields of classical studies, philosophy, or ancient history. The technology exists now. The scrolls are there, waiting. And for the first time in 2,000 years, the barrier between the ancient world and our modern understanding is finally breaking down, one neural network at a time. 3 college students armed with neural networks accomplished what centuries of scholars couldn't. They taught machines to read shadows left by ink that disappeared 2 millennia ago, proving that the past isn't truly lost, just locked away waiting for the right key. The Villa of the Papyri held 1,800 scrolls when Vesuvius struck. Only one has been partially read. 1,799 remain untouched. Beneath the excavated rooms, thousands more might still be buried in chambers that have never seen daylight since the eruption. Every one of them contains thoughts frozen at the instant disaster struck, unfiltered by copyists, medieval monks, Renaissance editors. The library is finally opening. This might just be one major discovery that completely rewrites our understanding of everything.